We've talked a lot about dependencies in Unity, largely due to complications of what tells what to do, when. And now we're going to talk about it a bit more because we have introducing a system that will help us manage a lot of our dependencies. And they're called events and actions. When we have one system commanding another system, we end up with a dependency. System A, like an input handler, needs a reference to system B, like a movement script, in order to pass along the commands. Move left, move right, go up, go down. And that's fine in most situations. If you're telling something what to do, it makes sense to introduce that reference variable, that dependency. I need to know what thing I'm telling what to do. There are some situations where we really don't want to have to introduce that dependency because it will complicate our system and be annoying to program with. And annoying means time consuming, it means buggy, it means tedious, it means it makes things harder than we want them to be. And programming is about making things easier on ourselves. So let's consider one case. Consider a manager that keeps track of all of the enemies in the scene. And it could tell them when a round has begun in a game where you need to kill all the enemies. Right? So it could tell the enemies when the round begins. It can tell them which enemies are still alive. If it's time to spawn in new enemies. And if the player has defeated all the enemies yet. It could also tell them that the player has paused the game and they all need to stop moving. If that manager had to keep a reference to every single enemy, that would be pretty frustrating to program with. We'd have to create a list that uses a slow and inefficient GameObject.find function. And that list would grow every time we'd want to spawn a new enemy in. It would shrink when we kill enemies. It might get more complicated as we introduce different enemies of different types. To know when an enemy dies, the enemy would now need a reference to the manager to be like, hey, take me off your list. And then now we have an interdependency, and we've learned that that's bad. Though we may not have the experience to know why that's bad, we just know it's something to avoid, generally. So let's introduce the concept of an event. An event is basically an intermediary function call. We run the event function whenever we want to, and then the event function then turns around and calls other functions on whatever listeners are listening to that event. The object calling the event does not need to have a reference to any of the listeners. It just says, all right, so there's a thing that happens, happen. And then even if it doesn't have any listeners, that's fine. It won't throw an error or crash the game, ideally. It'll just keep on trucking. So we just changed the number of dependencies that the manager has from an ever-changing complicated number that makes updating a scene hard and inefficient. We changed that to none, to no dependencies. It just fires an event. The manager just manages the events, and the only dependencies we have now are for the listening objects to know what events to listen to. And there are strategies for getting rid of these references or cleaning them up, and I'm going to go over those at the end when we get to how to actually implement this. Another thing we did, abstractly speaking, is flip our dependency. Instead of the manager needing a reference to an enemy, now the enemy needs the reference to the manager's event. This ability to flip a dependency around is a useful thing to know about when thinking on how to architect and structure our systems. We've basically just gained a lot more control over choosing what and how what things are dependent on what other things. So before we get into the practical side of this, let's talk about some terminology. A listener is an object that listens to an event, and a listener has an event handler. The event handler is the function that actually reacts or handles the event call. For the verb itself, I like to say call an event, and C# literally uses the function invoke, and many programmers I've heard use the terms fire or fire off colloquially. C# doesn't have a really common name for the caster of an event, but I've seen emitter, caster, invoker, messenger, signaler, caller. I've seen all these things used depending on the programming language, implementation, and the programmer's preference. I put out a Twitter question asking for input. We'll see what feedback we get from programmer friends of mine. Mostly the standards tend to be within companies, within groups, and personal preference, as well as depending on the language. Let's agree to not use the event excreter, and we'll be okay.